Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. It is Aisha from Aisha Reads, and today I will be telling you the process in which I review books as well as my July wrap-up, the books that I read for last month. This is my Excel sheet for how I review books, and this is just the books that I read in July as well as the books that I have read this month. Before doing this, I had a problem rating books. Like, I couldn't put a number on a book because I was like, I hope I'm not just rating a book because solely on how much I was entertained. Like, there's way much more to a book. I believe entertainment is definitely one of the key factors, but there's also believability, and there's also, just how much I connected to the characters and how relevant I think this book is. I got my rubric system from this blog called My Serenity. I'm just going to write it here as well as link it in the description box below. It was really helpful because I had no clue, had no idea how people read books and just put a number on it. That was very difficult for me. So I have a whole metric system to help me. To move on, I will be talking about the books that I read last month. My July wrap up. To start off, I read The Catcher in the Rye by JD Salinger. I picked this book up to recover from my reading slump. Was it the best idea? I'm not so sure. Okay, let's start. The Catcher in the Rye follows Holden Caulfield from his expulsion from secondary school to his ride back home. It shows us a story of this teenage boy trying to understand the world around him and going through depression and grief. It's a very heavy book, but it's not written in a way that's so cathartic. It's done really slyly, but you can also tell if you read very well. Let us start with my rating. I gave this book a 3.1, a 3, you can round it up to that. This is not to say that this book sucks, right? Like, for me, a 3 is a pretty good number because hardly any of the books I read are 5s. I really reserve those. But my problem with this book is I didn't like Holden. I didn't like Holden. And I don't think I didn't like Holden because he was a sucky character. I think as we read through the book, we find out different things about him, different things that he's going through in his life. But I didn't like him because I couldn't relate to him. Like, we are literally totally opposite people. And I feel like the way in which JD Salinger wrote this book, I didn't have this connection to him or this connection with him. That isn't to say that you wouldn't have this connection with him. It just made it more difficult for me to read. Also, I'm not the biggest fan of character giving stories, especially when I don't like the character. This is strongly character driven. Like, you are in his head, seeing things through his own perspective throughout the whole book. There's no problem with that. I think it's beautiful if you choose to write your story like that, or if you enjoy stories like that. I personally just don't read character driven stories because it doesn't really appeal to me. Aside from that, like I said, the way in which topics like depression and grief were discussed in this book were really sly, but they were also really powerful. And given the fact that this book was written after World War II, and it represented a certain period in time in which people were also going through certain struggles that Holden was going through, I do understand the importance of this book. I think it's really beautiful. But personally, I wish I had picked another book to recover from my reading slump. I think that's also one of the many reasons why this book also didn't really appeal to me. I should have probably selected a more entertaining book. Also, before we move on to whether or not I recommend this book, there's a certain page in here that really, I should have highlighted this.
1 hour later.
Okay, so like I said, this book was written in a way that certain points were just inserted very slyly, very low key. And this part, it's not a spoiler, I promise you, but if you have read it, you have read it, and it hit me. It hit me different because I was like, "Ooh, we have been in this dude's mind for this long. Like, look at the font for this book. We have been in his mind for this long, and we're just figuring this out." So it goes, that kind of stuff's happened to me about 20 times since I was a kid. I can't stand it. You know what? I read this line and I was like, what? Like, oh my goodness. It shocked me, and I think it just said something really powerful as to how this book was written. Like, how how I almost felt, at least me, I almost felt like, okay, I understand this dude's problem. He's going through some certain things in life, and he really just needs some time out. He really needs to reflect. And then reading that, it's like, does he even know exactly what he needs to reflect on? Like, does he understand maybe there are certain layers to the problems that he's experiencing that he's not even really aware of? So this book was definitely something. Like, it made me think. I won't lie to you. Would I recommend this book to you? Um, I'll just say the truth. I probably would end up reading this book, not this year, maybe in 2, 3 years. I would say if you are interested in being in somebody's mind for about 214 pages and just understanding how people process very, very serious emotions, that this will be the book for you to read. But if you're trying to get up from a reading slump, I wouldn't recommend this. So then the next book I read was Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. I just want to start off by saying that I started this book last year and I really got to the middle of it, but I just stopped. I didn't stop. I didn't DNF it on purpose. I just stopped because so many other things were happening in my life. Yeah, let's go into the synopsis of this novel. Things Fall Apart is a book set in the 1890s, so the late 1800s to the early 1900s, and it follows this man called Okonkwo in Umofia in the Igbo land in Nigeria, and this contrast between Igbo culture to missionary period, would I say. It's very interesting because you get to see the Igbo culture, you get to see their traditions, and you also get to see how Christian missionaries came into Igbo land and how that changed. Now, we don't really get to see that, but we get to see the early changes and how that affected Igbo culture and what it is today, and even to the larger conversation Nigerian culture. Where do I start? This book was. I just love the way Chinua Achebe writes. It is so simplistic, but not in a sense that he's explaining very simple things. He's actually explaining very complex concepts, but he doesn't do it in a way that's like dumbed down. It's simplistic. The way he writes it's simplistic, but it tells a very important story. I think the story is very relevant to who we are today. No matter where you're coming from, it really does. I feel like it could resonate with a large amount of people. This book kept me engaged. It was very interesting, very nice. My only problem with this book was the character development of certain characters. I feel like the only character that was really developed was Okonkwo. And I know Achebe said in one of his interviews that we were meant to understand and realize in Okonkwo was that he was very narrow minded. And I see how only developing Okonkwo and not developing other characters as like intimately to us could have depicted his narrowness better. But I also feel like that divided us from possible contrast of understanding how do I put this? Possible contrast of understanding how Okonkwo literally didn't see them as actual people. So what I'm trying to say is in the whole book, we know that Okonkwo is narrow. He's very misogynistic, he's very narrow minded, he's very one way, do it my way, or like it's only this way, like they can't be changed. And there's reasons for that. Like there's reasons from his upbringing as to why he's like that. And we are meant to follow this man throughout his whole journey and see how he sees people very one dimensionally and even himself very one dimensionally. But my issue with that is that I feel like if more depth was given to the characters, we would have been able to be more angry with how Okonkwo was able to just see them as one thing, as we would have seen them as complex creatures that Okonkwo just shut them out and just saw them one dimensionally. But in another sense, I think Okonkwo's or Achebe's writing, in which we only saw them one dimensionally, also allowed us to be in Okonkwo's head. Because I think if so much depth was given to the characters, like we probably would all hate Okonkwo. Like we already probably hated Okonkwo at some points in the book. But I think maybe putting us in his situation and just giving the depth from his own perspective and his inability to see other people as complex creatures allowed us to resonate with Okonkwo. Yeah, so that's my only like issue with this book. I think in a way it just held me back. I see how either way, like whether or not Achebe chose to develop or not develop characters, would have either helped or not helped the book. But I would have preferred if he developed the characters more, like the other characters more for me. So I gave this book a 4. I think it's really beautiful, but I think my inability to connect to the other characters made it a bit difficult for me to follow through at some times. So yes. Okay, so the next book I read was Wonder. Let me tell you why I read this book. I had this book on my shelf for months and I didn't pick it up. I did not pick it up, but I finished Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, and there was this, like, you know, when you read a book and then you're like, oh, I read a book, now I don't know what to do with my life except read another book. That's how I picked up Wonder. Whoa, okay, where do I start? I was up by 3 a.m. in the morning with my eyes red. That's the summary of this book. No, I'm joking. But seriously speaking, I read this book under 4 hours. I just sat down and just read everything because I was totally engrossed and I was wowed throughout the whole thing. I didn't take my eyes off for once. So this book follows Augie, as referred to this book, who has facial deformities because of a certain condition that he has. I'm going to write it here because it is difficult for me to pronounce. It just follows Augie and how and his, transition into school, middle school, and how other people, see him, accept him or don't accept him, and just his whole adventure, as well as other characters. We also see from other characters' perspective. I think it's a very beautiful book. It's simple, it tells a simple story, I would say. It's not too, the writing isn't too heavy, it's nice, it's beautiful. Honestly, I will read this book again before this year ends. I'm just going to tell you the truth, because this book this book is it. Like, this is the book to read. My only problem with this book was, see, I didn't want to do this because when I first read this book, like I said, I didn't have a rating system then, like earlier on. I gave this book a 5. But then I started reading the book and then I realized that I actually had a certain problem with it, which was the character arc believability. So there is a part in this book in which some, I don't want to say bad people, but some people who have acted badly, all of a sudden, acts good. And I don't want to be that person. Like, I don't want to be that person that tells people that they can't change, because I'm not. I'm not that person. It's just that the believability of their change or their transition or their development, it just wasn't there, because then there was really almost, it was such a lousy excuse as to why they changed. How do I say that in a way that's not me, that doesn't diminish this book? It was just so unbelievable, but I skipped through it because I was just in my feelings throughout this whole book. So I didn't really see it as an issue, but the more time I took to actually reflect on the book, I realized that that was actually a problem. Gave this book a 4.3. I think something very interesting that the author did was that she changed writing styles for certain perspectives. I just found that very interesting because I was like, oh, I can tell more about the character as opposed to just like what the author is saying. You know how in English class they always tell you show, don't tell? That was literally that was exactly what the writing change that the author did for this book. Would I be reading again? Would I recommend you guys to read it? Definitely yes, you should pick this up. The next book I read was Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ing. This story follows two families in a what is meant to be perfect town until a certain incident happens. And we see how these families are pit against each other and how their different moral structures play into each other. I give this book a 3.5, and I think I'm the only person that I know that didn't really get blown away by this book. The story itself was interesting. The only thing that kept me from really liking this book was the disconnect of myself from the actual mystery of the book. So there are different, genres to the book. There's mystery, there is drama, there's a lot of things going on, but the mystery didn't get to me, and that created a great, you know, disconnect between me and the book. It just made me feel disconnected in a sense. For me, so somebody in the book is meant to be mysterious, right? I don't want to spoil it. Somebody in the book is meant to be mysterious, and I like mystery books to some extent. But my problem was that from the beginning of the book, we knew that she was meant to be mysterious. So it didn't hit me like that. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, she was this normal person. All of a sudden, we find out that she was mysterious. No, she was mysterious from the beginning. That might be interesting to you. That might not be an issue to you. But for me, it was definitely something that kept me from connecting to the book very well. I just found it difficult to care at that point. Also, there was another character that was meant to have this shift of mind in the book. So it was meant to be this character that was like, oh, okay, they were supporting this certain position before, but then they started supporting the other position, and it was so unlikely. But my problem with that is that they didn't develop the character enough for me to care about that opinion, and it just seemed as if that was the whole reason why the character was even written into the book. Like, no shade, but it was just, I don't want to say the character's name because I would be spoiling the book if I did, but it was just, if you know, you know. He all of a sudden had an opinion that was profound, and I think it was just sad to me because I didn't really care that his opinion was different from what his opinion was initially meant to be, because we hardly ever saw his opinion throughout the whole book. He was just there in scenes, he was just there. And I watched the series, he's given more, development, there's more depth to him, but in the book there wasn't enough depth for me to even care about his opinion when he said it, and I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. Yeah, aside from that, it was an okay book. It didn't really get me at first. So those points that I stated also brought the mark further down. The last book that I read for this month was Windows by Jesutomisin Ipinmoye. On my Goodreads, I gave this a 5, but in reality it's more like a 4.7, 4.8. But I was like, oh, okay, it's already that high up. I might as well just round it up. I don't think I've actually ever read a book and give it a complete 5. But yes, I love this book. It really hit me different. If you have read this book, that story, Yellow Pawpaw, to me was just one of those stories that I will probably read and read and read again because of how beautifully it was written. It was set in Nigeria, different time periods, different ages, different people, different perspectives. I really liked it. I think it means a lot to what we're currently experiencing today, and even things we're not experiencing, even if you're not Nigerian, or even if you're not West African, or even if you're not African. I think you can still relate to that book on a very, very intimate level. It also discusses topics like grief and mental health disorders. So you might be wondering, Aisha, if you love this book so much, what was your issue? I think these are just more of stylistic preferences for me, as opposed to just like actual fundamental issues that destroyed the aim of the book. A mini issue was, I feel like there could have been a family tree, because there was a mystery slash crime story, and I really liked it, but at points I was confused because I was like, who is this person to who? I mean, at the end of the story, I understood because then depth and development was given. But at the beginning to kind of like early middle of the book, I was a bit confused, and I just really wish that there was a family tree for me to flip through and understand how people were connected to each other. Another kind of issue I had was that some of these stories had kind of loose ends. It wasn't an issue, like it's not a big thing. You know when an author writes a book, right, and then they just don't write the end story for everyone. That kind of happened in this book. It wasn't an issue, but I think that's just me and short stories to a large extent, is that there's always something of like this issue of, oh, okay, it doesn't really finish completely, or there's not enough character development because there's limited time, like limited space and limited words for, a short story. So I'm not the biggest fan of short story books, so that kind of also plays to it. But I definitely feel like this is one of those books where I would recommend to you if you came up to me and said, oh, I'm trying to get off from a reading slump. It was my favorite book of all the books that I read in July. So this is the end of my wrap up. I hope you guys like, subscribe, and share. Bye bye.